Ah, the conspiracy.
Conspiracy.
The conspiracy to get me sick.
Không biết đạt.
It's very windy today.
Nó cứng đúng không được? Kiểu cắm, gọi là cắm sạc xong sau 1 năm tự nhiên chuột nó lên.
Hồi đó con cũng cắm vậy á, xong rồi cái nó dính luôn cái ở trong. Biết sao giờ? Sao mà ở trường không ai phát hiện ra trốn. Sao mấy cái ổ nó bị đóng lại.
You see, you got covered with the cold now. This is the Okay, very good. So let's continue with the risky portfolio share. Now, again, the first part of this is stuff that I have done. You saw in the consumption section, and then we continue from there. So I will remind you. Okay, so we have the, quickly I will remind you. So we have this, you see here the reference, the International Economic Review 2003 paper, which is Infinite Horizon. There is another paper on your reading list, which is Mr. Gomez Michaelidis, that's Journal of Finance in 2005. But that uses, more complicated utility function. But if you want to see a finite horizon version of this, the reference is this paper, Review of Financial Studies, Coco Gomez Mahmoud, Review of Financial Studies 2005. Okay, so here we add these two no short sales constraints. So this prevents you from borrowing at the riskless rate, this first one, and the second one prevents you from borrowing at the risky rate from short selling stocks. And both of these papers, the finite horizon and infinite horizon, use cost of the risk aversion utility function that you know well. And if rho is equal to 1 is logarithmic, thus could also have been, that's also part of this. And you have to specify the income process, and we had said that the actual income level is the permanent income level times a transitory shock, UIT. And of course, if you express this in logarithms, you get the typical, the usual thing that you're used to. So it would be lowercase yit is equal to lowercase pit, but p is permanent, not the price level, and lowercase uit. And this is the transitory shock, UIT. It's log normally distributed, so the logarithm of u is normally distributed. And it's IID, so identically dependently distributed. So the transitory shock you get this period doesn't tell you anything about the transitory shock you're going to get next period. UIT doesn't tell you anything about UIT plus 1, okay? And then you have to specify also how the permanent income component evolves. And here we specify, so this is the Chris Carroll formulation. Chris Carroll proposed this, and lots of papers in this literature use this. So the permanent income evolves like this, which maybe you can understand even better by dividing both sides by PIT minus 1. So you get here on the left-hand side, you get the growth factor in permanent income. 1 plus the growth rate in permanent income is GT, this GT, which is deterministic. It depends on T, but it's on time, but it's deterministic. And NIT is what we call the permanent shock, because it is a shock to the growth factor of permanent income. Itself is also IID, okay, and log normally distributed. So NIT doesn't tell you anything about NIT plus 1, but it's called the permanent shock because it shocks the growth factor of permanent income. And also here you can see that NIT is going to affect PIT, and PIT is going to enter here when, and it's going to affect PIT plus 1. And then, it will keep going like this. So in some sense, NIT will be incorporated in future values of the permanent income. It doesn't disappear. Whereas this UIT completely disappears and it doesn't affect YT plus 1, right? So for both of these reasons, we call NIT permanent, the permanent shock. But you should not infer from that, whatever NIT is, NIT plus 1 will be, etc. That's not true. It doesn't tell you anything about NIT plus 1. Okay, and then these assumptions, the log normality assumption in particular has this implication that the log normality assumption will allow you to compute these things, right? And the result of this is that expected labor income is the permanent component. So that gives you a way to interpret the permanent income, right? That gives you a way to interpret permanent income, which is the expected level of income for somebody of that age and education, for period T. So how would you be estimating also this? Well, let me say this as well. The expected growth factor of permanent income is this GT, which may depend on time. Okay. So, so the first thing gives us an interpretation. The second result gives us a way to calibrate this model, and that is to go to the data and to panel data like PSID that I mentioned, and estimate divide population by education levels. This is typically, what is done, and you assume and you estimate a different income process for each education level. So you have less than high school education, then you have high school but not college, and then you have college degree or more. So these are typically the three groups into which people divide the data, the population, and then you estimate one income process for each of these groups, right? And that income process, you can plot the age income profile. So in other words, you can say at different levels of income, plug in different levels of income and calculate the expected, different ages, right? Different ages, and compute the expected level of income for each age. And that gives you an age income profile for the less than high school group or for the college group, right? And then that age income profile gives you permanent income. That's the expected income for that group, for a member of that group, at each age. So that would be PIT. That gives you PIT. And of course, PIT divided by PIT minus 1, you can also compute from that. And that gives you the GT, the growth factor of permanent income, that you have estimated from the data and that you want to incorporate in your computational model, right? So you're going to be using that. Now, when you have finite horizon models like the Coco-Commerce-Man put, this GT is always pretty much dependent on time. So it changes. So it grows, you start at young ages, the start of economic life, you start with lower incomes, expected incomes, and then the expected income grows over your career, and then you hit retirement, and the expected income drops and stays at some, pension, retirement level, pretty much constant, quite stable over the rest of life. Okay, so this GT is very much dependent on your age, right? That will be evolving with time. When you have an infinite horizon model like ours, you can't use these are Peter Pans, right? There are no Peter Pans in the data, so you can't really estimate an age income profile, and how could you, right? Age goes to infinity, it's an infinite support, so that doesn't make sense. So what normally we do with infinite horizon models is to say, okay, what's the long run growth rate of the economy? So maybe it's 2% or something like that, and then we use that for G, and then it's not GT, it's G. For everybody, permanent income is growing at 2%. And then we had derived last time, I had told you that with two constraints, we have a Lagrange multiplier in each of these two first order conditions. So that's the Lagrange multiplier for the BT greater than or equal to 0 constraint, the Lagrange multiplier for ST greater than or equal to 0 constraint. And these also, of course, can vary with time, right? So there are, these constraints may be binding in certain periods of time and not be binding in other periods of time, or they may be more binding or less binding. So So what does it mean, more binding and less binding? As we had discussed, the Lagrange multiplier gives you the increase in the objective, right? Which is expected lifetime utility, discounted utility. The increase in the objective, if I relax the constraint for, Bt by an epsilon. So in period T, I allow you now to borrow epsilon instead of 0, right? And the question is, how much does this add to the expected utility objective, lifetime utility objective? And the answer would be this lambda Bt, right? And the same for lambda St, okay? That I relax the short sales constraint on stocks by an epsilon, and this tells you how much the objective goes up. Okay. But now, because these two don't need to be equal between them, when I come to subtract one from the other to do the reductio ad absurdum, I can no longer do it, right? Because this difference, you see here, this difference can very well be positive, and that's not a contradiction. So I cannot rule out this particular case. What I can do, of course, is you could say, okay, how about if this is 0? Yeah, if this is 0, it works, but what does it mean for this to be 0? That both of these constraints, both of these Lagrange multipliers are 0. And if both of those are 0, I have accomplished nothing by introducing these two constraints, borrowing constraints. I have introduced two borrowing constraints, and neither of them is binding. So it's really, I'm back to square one, where I didn't have them, right? There is no difference. Yes, of course, reductio ad absurdum works. But could they be negative? Because if this difference is negative, then that would also be a contradiction, given the historical equity premium or something. But that's not possible either, because of the interpretation of these two Lagrange multipliers, right? So this tells me how much your expected utility, lifetime utility, will rise if I let you borrow an epsilon more at a rate that's lower and riskless, right? And then lambda S tells me how much your expected lifetime utility will rise if I let you borrow at a rate that, epsilon, at a rate that is both higher in expected terms and risky, right? So you will clearly prefer the lower riskless rate to borrow, right? So lambda B can either be equal to lambda S if both are 0, or if they are not both 0, lambda B has to be greater than lambda S, right? So this difference is either 0, which I discussed, or it is positive, but it cannot be negative. And if it's positive, it's not a contradiction, right? I cannot apply right then. Okay, and here are the graphs that I had shown you, and we had briefly discussed, right? But let's come back and discuss them in a little bit more detail and make it even clearer, what the problem is here. So we get three different regions in the computational solution. First of all, everything gets normalized by permanent income, right? And the reason that this is so is that this model is homothetic with respect to permanent income. So the lifetime utility here is a function of AT which is financial assets, and that's the endogenous, or if you like, XT, which is financial assets plus labor income, cash on hand, and that's the endogenous state variable, and it's also a function of RT and of this and R tilde T stock. The stock return is also a function of the riskless rate, and the thing is that, and we can also decompose this XT plus 1, and we can put in the state variables here, in the list of state variables, we can put permanent income, and we can put the AT separately. Okay, so you have AT, R tilde T, RF, PT. Okay. Now this model is homothetic in the sense that if I multiply each of those, each of the consumption variables and the state variables, I am, by a constant, I'm getting something that gets multiplied by that same constant. So I can actually divide everything by permanent income, normalize everything by permanent income, and the solution remains unaffected. So here, actually the solution that the model gives us is consumption divided by permanent income, and here we have cash on hand divided by permanent income, okay? Normalized by permanent income. And here are stocks normalized by permanent income, and here is normalized cash on hand, bonds by permanent income. Here, of course, is the risky portfolio share. It's already stocks divided by stocks plus bonds, so there's nothing, whether you normalize by permanent income each of these variables or not, you get the same alpha. So here it doesn't make a difference, but of course here you have normalized cash on hand. You're plotting the optimal risky portfolio share against normalized cash on hand. So here you see what I was telling you yesterday, that if you take the standard model on face value, then what it means is that Bill Gates is a pumped up version of the homeless person under the bridge, okay? Because everything is proportional to permanent income, right? So you are getting, consumption or stocks or bonds as a fraction of permanent income against, cash on hand normalized by permanent income. So somebody who has 1 million times the permanent income of another should have, according to this model, 1 million times the bond level of the other, right? And 1 million times the stock level, 1 million times the consumption. But in terms of participation in the stock market, the bond market, etc., they should be exactly where the poor person is, right? Who just got pumped up through this calculation. So when we talk about portfolios of the rich, we will see very clearly that this has nothing to do with the data. Nothing to do with it. Okay. And then, you have these three regions, and recall that they don't have to be, these first two regions don't have to be equal, they just so happen to be here in my drawing. And here, this distance should be the sum total of normalized stocks plus normalized bonds, because this is normalized saving, right? So this is the 45-degree line, this is consumption, so the difference between normalized X and normalized consumption is normalized saving, right? Which is the sum total of the amount you put in stocks and the amount you put in bonds. Okay. So this doesn't look accurate in the diagram either. Okay, so these are the two things to bear in mind, not to be confused by the diagram. Okay, so what do you see here in this lower range? And the final thing is, whom are we comparing as we are going across this axis? Well, we are comparing one household relative to itself, but with a different realization of normalized cash on hand, right? So this is not a comparison of rich and poor. This is a description of what a particular household would do depending on the realization of normalized cash on hand. And you may say, okay, but what is this normalized cash on hand? Well, remember, X is AT plus YT, right? Or AIT plus YIT, right? So as wealth plus income, labor income. If I divide by permanent income, what do I get? I get normalized wealth, wealth divided by permanent income, plus YIT, which is permanent, PIT times UIT divided by PIT. So basically what I'm getting, that second term is just a transitory shock, right? You see this, or am I confusing you? Here, right? If I normalize by permanent income, I just get UIT, right? Yes?
Yep.
So basically, X divided by P is A divided by B, normalized wealth, plus UIT, okay? Yeah? So what does it mean to be at different levels of normalized X here? Well, basically, this tells you something about, well, it tells you something, of course, about the level of your wealth, right? But it also tells you something about the transitory shock you got, right? So maybe you got a big positive transitory shock, a big transitory shock, and that pushed you to the right on this axis. Maybe you got a small transitory shock and pushed you to the left. And of course, the other determinant is how wealthy are you at a particular point in time. That determines the starting point, right? But on top of that, you get the transitory income shock. So it could be, right, that a comparison between this point and this point only results because of different transitory shock, but it could also be that the comparison between this point and this point results from a different wealth level, right? So we have to be thinking about those two determinants. But we are comparing one household to itself, right? In a different, on a different level of X. Okay, so what do you see here? So when the household finds itself in this lowest range of normalized cash on hand, so this can be, because of very low wealth, normalized wealth, or because of very low transitory shock, or both, the household is desperate to borrow. The household knows that, this is not going to be typically the case. I mean, they just had bad luck and they ended up here. So they would like to borrow against the future where they expect to do better. So they would, of course, like to borrow at the riskless rate, and I'm not letting them do that, so they are stuck at zero. But they are so desperate to borrow that they would even borrow at the risky rate, right? And I'm not letting them do that, so they are stuck at zero here as well. So here you get a range where you can justify zero stock holding, right? But you see that this same range is also one with zero bond holding. So these are the people that consume all of their cash on hand. And these people are known in recent literature, they are known as hand-to-mouth people, hand-to-mouth. So whatever they get in their hands, they eat, right? They don't save anything, right? So if this were a convincing explanation for zero stock holding, it would only apply to people with zero wealth. They don't have any wealth here. Okay? But we know in the data there are lots of people who don't have stocks but have positive wealth, and some of them significant wealth, right? Large wealth. But it's not even good for those people with zero wealth, because here it says that these people should want to short stocks, right? To borrow at the risky rate. And I'm not letting them short stocks. But how many people with zero wealth do you know who want to short stocks? I don't know anybody, right? It just doesn't make sense. And actually, you know, this point that I just made, you know, people don't realize this. You know, I come to, whenever I say this, I mean, not the students, you guys realize it. But my colleagues, you know, the thought hasn't crossed their mind. They say, okay, oh yeah, these are zero. Yeah, it doesn't make sense. You know, it's not applicable. It's mathematically correct, but it's not applicable in the data. And then you have this intermediate region. You know, over here, of course, none of the constraints is binding. We are back to reductio ad absurdum. I mean, I don't have to say anything. You know, this region, this range doesn't justify, explain zero stock holding. I mean, I don't have to say anything. I don't have to say anything about participation, but I would have to say a lot about the risky portfolio share. Okay, so here in this intermediate range, what do you see? The logic of the model is sound. It says people would like to borrow at the riskless rate, right? And I'm not letting them, so they are stuck at zero bonds. But they are not so desperate as they were here, right? So they would like to borrow at the riskless rate. You know, if I offered them to borrow at the risky rate, they wouldn't want to do that, okay? They are not that desperate, right? They are doing okay. I mean, they are not in the minimum range of normalized cash on hand. So they are holding stocks, and they are not holding any bonds. So here in this entire range, consumption is below the 45-degree line, and this is a little bit thick line, and you can see that, you know, consumption in this entire range, consumption is below the 45-degree line. The distance is the amount of stock holding, okay? And then you say, okay, you know, does this make sense? Does this range make sense? And it doesn't make a lot of sense in the data either, because who are these people? I mean, these are people who are putting everything in stocks. So they are saving, they have wealth, right? And they are putting everything in stocks, and they have zero in the bank account, right? How many such people do you know? I mean, you know, I can't rule out that there may be a few, right? I mean, there are lots of crazy people around, right? But in general, the idea that you wouldn't put anything in the bank account and you would put everything in stocks, risk your entire wealth, it's just too much, right? This corresponds to a risky portfolio share of 1 over here in this range, right? And that's too much. The model predicts too much stock holding in this particular range of normalized cash on hand. So this doesn't make much sense. And here, what's going on here? So here, actually I managed to plot it that this is rising at a, you know, less fast than this, okay? So what's going on here? The prediction of the model is a downward sloping risky portfolio share, okay? So what does that mean? That as you experience larger and larger normalized cash on hand, your exposure to stocks goes down, right? Should go down. It's optimal for it to go down. And you ask yourself, okay, what's the logic of the model? Why is the model telling us this, right? And, you know, a way to think about this is go back to what we were discussing before, the interpretation of X, normalized cash on hand, right? So to be, as you are more and more in this range, I mean, we know that X is determined by two things, by your normalized wealth and by the transitory shock, the UIT. But as you move out, more and more out in this range, it becomes more like, UIT is drawn from a particular distribution, right? And it's the same for that entire axis, x-axis, right? It becomes more likely that as you are more to the right, that you are a wealthy person. You are primarily depending on your wealth to finance your consumption. You have high wealth relative to permanent income. So you are primarily depending on your wealth to finance consumption rather than on the transitory income, right? So as you are moving to the right, up in the levels of X, you are depending more and more on wealth to finance consumption, so you should be more and more conservative with the portfolio composition of your wealth. You care about the riskiness of consumption. You are relying more and more on wealth to finance consumption, so you cannot afford to have wealth be very risky, right? So you want to reduce risk exposure as you are moving more to the right. This makes sense?
Yeah.
Yeah? So the model has inherent logic. The model is not crazy, right? What it says here is logical, what it says here is logical, and what it says here is logical, right? It's just not true, okay? It's just not true in the data. Because what you can do in the data, right, is you can say, you can run a regression and you can look at the risky portfolio share as people are, getting wealthier, for given permanent income. So you run a regression and you put some proxies for permanent income. And normally, if either there is a question in the survey, what's your normal level of income, and that would be your variable for permanent income, right? That would be your proxy for permanent income. That's one possibility. If you have survey data and you ask people how much is your income or was your income last year, and how much would have been your normal level of income for last year, did you do better than normal, worse than normal, etc. So you can use that as a proxy for permanent income. Why? Because we said permanent income is the expected level of income, is the estimated level of income from the age income profile, is the normal level of income for somebody with this particular education and this particular age. So if you ask them, you can use that as a proxy for permanent income in the regression. But if you don't have such data, and normally you don't, you can put education and age variables in the regression to control for permanent income, right? Because these should be capturing permanent income, even though you don't know what the level of permanent income is. And then, controlling for these age education variables, controlling for the permanent income, and you can even put the actual income in, so you're also controlling for UIT. You find typically that the risky portfolio share goes up with wealth, doesn't go down with wealth. Right? So wealthier people are more exposed to risk rather than less exposed to risk. Okay? In the data. So we need a different model to explain that. Okay? And we are going to see such a model, which is quite brilliant actually in how it was conceived.
Professor?
Yeah.
That's like, so in the middle range of
Yeah.
wealth level X, they prefer stock, a bit more risky, is that then on the safer one?
Yes, because the logic of the model, right, is what's going on with borrowing, right? They would like to borrow, still would like to borrow in this range, but they would only like to borrow if they can borrow at the riskless rate, right? Now I'm shutting this possibility for them, and they say, okay, so sorry, thank you, I'm not going to borrow at the risky rate, right? So if this constraint, ST greater than or equal, is not binding, then ST is positive, right? If it were binding, it would be like this, ST equals 0. But they are saying, I don't want to borrow at the risky rate, which means lambda S is 0, right? The constraint is not binding, which means stocks are positive, right? Otherwise, if it were binding, they would be 0, right? But the constraint is not binding, so stocks are positive. So if you take it from the borrowing side, it makes perfect sense. But if you take it from the asset allocation side, it's an extreme exposure to risk, right? That the risky portfolio, it's portfolio, it has been called portfolio specialization in stocks, right? And people have been saying, my goodness, this is too, and we know that there aren't such people, or if there are a couple of observations in the data, so that's not empirically relevant, this prediction of the so that is what is going on there. And I should also tell you, okay, since you asked, let me say one more thing. So Hedon and Lucas had a paper in the late 90s, and they noticed this, and they said that, that's too much. Portfolio specialization in stocks is not realistic. So they said, okay, so maybe the assumption of a 0 correlation between stock returns and income is wrong, right? So let's introduce positive correlation between stock returns and income. So what I was discussing yesterday. So basically, when you have high income, the stock market is doing well. When you have low income, the stock market is doing bad. So holding stocks exacerbates your income risk, right? Your consumption risk, because they move together with income, right? And that lowers your demand for stocks, okay? That lowers you because stocks exacerbate your risk, you want less stocks. So they managed to get, in their model, they managed to get, a bigger range like this. So maybe all of these people, maybe, to go to 0 stock holding, right? And they said, Triumph, we have explained the problem and we have solved the problem. The assumption of 0 correlation between stock returns and labor income is the problem, right? So let's assume positive correlation. But they ignored the fact that I was telling you before, the frustrated short sellers. How did they solve the problem? They got this constraint to be binding over here, which means that these people are trying to short sell stocks and they can't. And again, then they are non-stock holders because of that. And again, we don't see that in the data. So they provided a solution which is also counterintuitive. Okay? But here we are sort of assuming 0 correlation. Anyway, so that's a problem. And then, as I did in macro, now forget that this is an infinite horizon model. The nice thing about infinite horizon is you can draw one set of policy rules and they hold for all periods, right? But forget that this is infinite horizon, and suppose we switch to the Coco-Gomez-Mann-Hood model of finite horizon. And there, actually, they haven't introduced the bonds and stocks, the no short sales constraint. No, that's not true. They have introduced that. They have not introduced fixed costs or whatever else. Okay. So here, what happens as you age, right? So if you have finite horizon, this is not Peter Pan anymore, right? So the agent, the household ages over time. So what happens here is that your predicted, the optimal risky portfolio share starts shifting inwards, right? Which means what? That for any given normalized cash on hand, you would be hitting the policy rule, you know, at a lower level as you are aging. Put in terms that your grandma will understand, for any given, you know, wealth and, you know, normalized cash on hand, for any given level of that, as you are aging, you should be reducing your exposure to stocks. Okay? And unfortunately, in the US data, as we will see, this is not very visible, this prediction. But in the most recent, you know, 2017 sort of state-of-the-art stockholding paper of Fagen, Wiso, Gottlieb, I believe. So they are using Norwegian data, and we will see that in the Norwegian data, you do get this. Okay? So some hope for the model or some version of the model. I mean, actually considerable hope, because they expanded the model, they introduced a disaster probability, and they also introduced fixed costs, and they are getting the Norwegian data to, the model to look much more like Norwegian data. So my discussion of this slide, you know, has probably demoralized you that we don't understand anything about the data. But as I said, you know, with the Norwegian data and with some bells and whistles in the model, we are getting predictions much closer to at least the Norwegian data. So this is not my final word on theory versus data in terms of risky portfolio exposure and stuff. Okay. But this is the first word, that the simple things, the simple model, and US data don't work together. Okay. So this is what I was telling you. And we will see the Wachter and Yogo model, and that will be the model that I told you handles this problem with the double sloping risky portfolio share. Okay. Okay. So that's you know, the discussion of the risky portfolio share. So let me now go to the next. And now we are entering, you know, new territory. Stuff you have not seen before. Okay. Okay, so now let's go and look a little bit deeper into this risky portfolio share, you know, compare it with the data, but in the process also learn things about how to interpret different types of data, etc. Okay, so here, you know, in the previous model, in the standard model, we didn't have fixed costs, right? I mean, the model that I just discussed, the way I discussed it, I did not introduce fixed costs, right? the model of the finite horizon model of Coco-Gomez-Mann also doesn't have fixed costs. Okay? But my model with Michailidis in 2003 also introduced fixed costs, and this part is from there. Okay. So how can we introduce fixed costs of entry participation in this type of model, right? And how can we assess if the model with fixed costs makes sense? Okay, so the idea there is to say, let's consider the ticket fee, okay? It's you in front of Disneyland, and you are considering whether to pay the ticket fee. And you have two options. One option is to stay out, not pay the ticket fee, stay out, but this means you don't get access to the rides in Disneyland, right? So in other words, if you don't pay the fee, you can only use bonds, okay? So if you don't pay the fee, I'm back to the model of one asset, right? Saving in the riskless, in just one asset in the riskless asset. And I can compute the expected lifetime utility from the one asset model, right? Just using bonds. Okay? And I can call this VB. That's the expected lifetime utility from only using bonds. And that, of course, will be a function of my X, normalized cash on hand. It will be a different utility depending on my X. Now, I was telling you that the value function includes other state variables. I told you it was X, it was the gross interest factor, it was, and here that would be it. But actually, these are exogenous policy variables, so I have omitted them. I'm just focusing on the endogenous policy variables. Okay, and what is your other option? The other option is to pay the ticket and get into Disneyland. Okay, and then you get access to both bonds and stocks, right? So then you can solve the two asset model. If you pay the fee, you can solve the two asset model, and your value, your expected lifetime utility, will be determined by the two asset model. Okay? So, but you won't have X. You will have X minus K, which is the entry cost. Okay? Now, why do I have this little X here? I mean, this is, I have K as a function of X. The fixed cost is what it is, right? Why do I have it here? Because, in the first stage, when you understand the model, when you understand what you have to do, you say, in one case I have VB of X, I get VB of X. In the other case, where I pay the fixed cost, I get VS of X minus K, okay? But I don't know K. I can't calibrate K. Let's go back to the discussion yesterday. Perceived cost, opportunity cost of time, all of this, it's not observable. It's not easy to observe it, right? So what can I hope to do here using the model? I can solve for the minimum K that makes me indifferent between entering and exiting, entering and not entering, right? So that is a function of X, okay? So I wrote it K of X because this is an equation now that I have to solve, that I can solve, to find the minimum fixed cost that at which I would be indifferent between entering and not entering. So that's the minimum entry cost, fixed cost that can keep me out of the market. Right? So that is the that is the solution to this. Then the k of x is the solution to this. And then you can see how this k of x depends on different parameters, right? Which you can do, you can just solve the model for different parameters, and then you get, very reasonable results, as we will see, plus a surprise that I'm going to discuss. Okay, let me say one more thing here. Our 2003 paper contains a mistake, okay, that the referees and the editor did not notice, and of course we had not thought about. And this very smart guy, Steve Zeldis, told me about this, figured out the mistake that we had made here, because I was using this same approach to write another paper, and he discouraged. I mean, there is a solution to the mistake, and the mistake, can be solved. And in the Gomez Michailidis paper, it was solved and everything. So, but I never produced the other paper because he found it. But anyway, that's for other reasons. Okay. So what is the mistake? I want to tell you, because it's a little bit non-trivial, and it complicates things, but it's good for you to know. So what was the mistake? The way we were thinking here, and maybe the way I got you to think now, is that I'm facing a once and for all choice. I'm outside Disneyland, and my choice is to pay the fee and enter Disneyland forever, right? Or not to pay the fee and stay out of Disneyland forever, right? Then I can separate the two models, the model with stocks and the model without stocks, just with bonds. I can solve them independently of each other, right? I can compute BB of x, right? And Vs of x minus kx. And I can solve this equation, right? So what we did in that paper would be appropriate if somebody were to tell us it's now or never, right? Either you decide to enter the stock market now, and it's forever, you're in, or you don't decide to enter and you don't get another chance to enter, right? But in reality, you have a chance, even if you decide today to not enter the stock market, you have a chance to enter the stock market tomorrow, right? Next year. So what should we be doing? What does one need to do? I mean, the equation is not wrong, but how we compute Vs and Vb needs to be modified. So what you need to do is, even for an infinite horizon model, you start from finite horizon and you go backwards, right? And for a finite horizon model, obviously, you start from the last period. So you have the first two period model. You go to, in the last period, you're going to consume everything. If there is no bequest motive, you're going to eat everything. So that's a simple solution. In the period, you start then in period t minus 1, capital T minus 1, right? The penultimate period, one period before last. And you solve this problem, because in this penultimate period, you only have one next period. The next period, you don't get another chance to enter the stock market. You eat it all and you die, okay? So, but you are in one period before that, right? So one period before that, you either pay the fee and you get access to BB, right? To BS, to the full model, right? So you solve the model with bonds and stocks and you compute Vs x minus k of x, right? Or you don't pay k, you don't pay the fixed cost, and then you have access to BB of x, right? So you solve for period capital T minus 1, and and you find the cutoff X, for which you enter the stock market or you don't enter the stock market, etc. And then you go to the period T minus 2, and now you know that for a range of X in period T minus 1, the next period, you are going to enter the market, the stock market, and get access to B of S. And for another range, you don't enter the market and you get access to B of B. Okay? So what you should do in period capital T minus 2 is you should solve now the problem for T minus 2, but your expected next period value function is a combination of the two value functions. With a certain probability, you will be in the range of X in which you will choose not to enter the stock market. And with another probability, you will be in the range of X in which you will enter the stock market, right? So your expected lifetime utility next period is going to have to take both choices into account. And based on that possibility, you decide the range of X for which you enter this period, the range of X for which you don't enter this period. And then you repeat for T minus 3, T minus 4, etc. You see, it's a more complicated situation, but it's correct, that's the correct way to do it, in the sense that you have this choice every period, and you have to allow, when you're sitting today at some random period at age 30, right, and you're thinking about the future, you cannot say either I do it today and it's forever, or I don't do it today and it's forever. You have to make a decision for today, knowing that you are going to make the same decision, you are going to have the same choice next period, right? So that's the correct way to do it. Now, is it leading to qualitatively different results? No. So what I'm going to tell you on the next slide is going to hold for this type, for the correct version of the model as well, right? So we have not misled the entire world with our analysis, and and the conclusions we drew are still qualitatively correct. But the numbers that we are computing are not totally correct, because they are ignoring this repeated choice. Okay. So here, what do we do? So now we solve this equation for k of x, right? And we want to see how that is our threshold fixed cost, the minimum fixed cost to keep you out of the stock market. How does that depend on parameters in the model, right, that characterize either your preferences or the level of the equity premium, so the market environment that you're facing. So here we're going to consider two rates of time preference. So here you are discounting, so this is beta is 1 divided by 1 plus delta, right? This delta is the rate of time preference. I mean, we have used other Greek letters to denote it, but here we denote it by delta. But beta is 1 over 1 plus delta. So here you are discounting more, and here you are discounting less, the future less. So here you are more impatient, less impatient. Okay? So that's one experiment. Another experiment is, what's the level of the equity premium? The historical equity premium in the US was 6%. Let's consider 4.2%, a lower equity premium. Where could this be coming from? Well, some people said, we should incorporate taxes, allow for taxes, dividend taxation, in the computation of equity premium, so the actual equity premium is smaller than 6. So that covers that. We have seen that subjective perceptions of the equity premium differ across people, right? I told you the Dominic Zemansky paper that asked people what they perceive the equity premium to be, and there was a lot of heterogeneity in that. So another way to think about this comparison is to say these are the optimists and these are the pessimists, right? Then we talked about trust, right? And with trust, there is a probability that you will be cheated, right? So that reduces your expected return on stocks. So another way to think of that comparison is to say, okay, here are the people who are trusting others, and here are the people who are suspicious of others, and they don't trust them as much. So these are three possible interpretations, and I don't have to take a stance. I mean, these results apply to all three in some sense. Okay. Then what other thing are we going to vary? Well, this is core. Core is the correlation between stock returns and labor income, right? So we know in the base model this correlation is assumed to be zero, right? We know that when the correlation is negative, you are even more likely to be holding stocks, okay? So we are considering actually positive correlation, where stocks are exacerbating your income, your consumption risk. So when positive correlation between stock returns and incomes. So when your income is high, the stock return is high. When your income is low, the stock return is low. So this makes stocks undesirable for you, less desirable for you, right? And this is, the case that Heaton and Lucas considered, that lowers the optimal risky portfolio share, etc. So we want to understand what's happening in that case. And we will be comparing the zero correlation, which is the top panels, to the positive correlation at the bottom. And finally, what's the other thing we're doing? This row is relative risk aversion. So we have constant relative risk aversion utility function. This is the relative risk aversion. So we want to make people more risk averse, and three different levels of risk aversion, and we want to compare what's happening for all these different cases. So lots of things to consider here. I will tell you that this last experiment was a surprise to us. We were shocked when we saw the results of this, and the fact that we understood this, was one of the contributions of the paper, and I'll tell you, what this is due to. Okay, so let's start with impatience. So these are the impatient people, these are the more patient people, right? And what do you see here? You see, and these numbers are the threshold fixed costs required to keep people out of the market. What do you see here? That as I compare this number to this number, this number to this number, this number to this number, it takes a higher cost to keep out the people who are more patient. Okay? And also here. So what's the intuition for that? Well, the returns from stocks I'm going to get in the future, right? I'm saving today, and I'm going to get the returns from stocks in the future. So the more impatient I am, the less I value the stock returns I'm going to get, right? Because they come in the future. So the more impatient I am, the smaller the threshold fixed cost that's required to keep me out of the market. I'm already not valuing the benefits of the stock market very much, so I'm willing to stay out with a smaller fixed cost than somebody who values them, who's more patient and values them more. Okay? Make sense? If you lose me at any point, you interrupt, okay? So that's experiment number 1, right? Experiment number 2, 6% equity premium versus 4.2% equity premium. So, you know, the optimist, the trusting versus the pessimist, the less trusting. So what, you know, the higher the equity premium you expect, so go compare this to this now. Compare this to this. So, you know, compare this to this to this. So in all cases, if my perceived equity premium is bigger, you need a bigger fixed cost to keep me out, right? And this is consistent with what I was telling you yesterday, that we are comparing the fixed cost to the product of the equity premium times desired stock holding, right? So if I have my perceived equity premium is smaller because I'm not trusting or because I'm pessimistic, I need a smaller fixed cost to be kept out of the market. Okay? So that makes sense as well. And, you know, indeed, this result justifies, you know, the hand waving I was doing yesterday, right? Okay, so that's result number 2. Yeah? So it's the threshold fixed cost. So this is the minimum cost to make you indifferent between entering or not. So if the cost is at that level, you could be in, you could be out, okay? So because it's the threshold, that's what we are computing. I mean, you're right, it should be an epsilon larger to make sure you are out, right? You know, because it's a threshold, it's a limiting case, that's what, you know, we are computing. But you can think of it as, yes, if it is this, it's indeterminate. The model doesn't tell you whether you're in or out. You could be in, you could be out, right? If it's an epsilon bigger, you're out. Okay, so that's the question makes sense. So the third case, zero correlation versus positive correlation. And what do you see here? You have to compare this to this, this to this, this to this, and the same here. So basically, and you know, you can do it here as well. So what do you see? You see a uniform result, which is if you are facing positive correlation, then you can be kept out of the market with lower fixed costs, right? Which is again very consistent with what we were saying before. If your stock returns are positively correlated with labor income, then they are less desirable for you. They are exacerbating your consumption risk. So you are more likely to want to stay out, so I can keep you out with a lower fixed cost. Okay. So that comes from that. Okay, clear? Okay, and now let's go to the surprising thing. So what are we doing here? We are making people more risk averse, right? 5 is bigger than 2, 8 is bigger than 5. So these people, as we're going down the list, these people are becoming, you know, more risk averse. So grandma would tell you more risk averse people want to hold fewer stocks, right? So in principle, the more risk averse you are, the smaller the fixed costs I would need to keep you out. But what do you see here? I'm making you more risk averse and I need a bigger fixed cost to keep you out. So that's where we have a heart attack, right? Where on earth is this coming from? Okay? You see the contradiction? I mean, it's the opposite of what grandma would expect,
Mm.
right? And here is the reason. The reason is that with constant relative risk aversion, with the standard preferences that we're using, if you compute risk aversion in the constant relative risk aversion utility function, it will be this rho, right? Rho will be relative risk aversion. If you compute prudence for the constant relative risk aversion utility function, prudence is also rho. So you have one parameter, rho, that governs both risk aversion and prudence. Okay? You cannot vary risk aversion without varying prudence. Okay? Prudence, you remember, determines how much precautionary wealth you want to hold, right? So the higher the prudence level, the more precautionary wealth you want to hold, right? The higher risk aversion level, the less desirable are stocks. So here, the way to think about this is to say S is equal to alpha times A, which is, AT, which is your wealth, right? So what's going on here? You have we are increasing rho, right? Rho reduces the risky portfolio share. So rho operates on the risky portfolio share, and the more risk averse you are, the smaller the risky portfolio, the portfolio share you want to allocate to stocks. So what I told you before, the more risk averse you are, the less you like stocks. What does it mean, like? It means that your desired risky portfolio share is lower, gets lower, right? So higher rho means lower alpha. But higher rho also means higher prudence. So higher rho means a bigger wealth level, right? Out of prudence, because of prudence, because I can't vary risk aversion and prudence independently. So when I increase rho in this model, I have two competing effects, a downward effect on alpha coming from risk aversion, an upward effect on wealth coming from prudence. And it turns out that in all our calibrations, but also in other models, other papers, calibrations, this effect of prudence dominates the effect of risk aversion. So you actually get a higher demand for stocks. Look at this, right? You get a higher demand for stocks as you are increasing rho, because prudence dominates. Okay? And you can see how big the prudence effect is when you look at consumption, right? When you are plotting the consumption policy rules for different degrees of risk aversion, right? What do you see? You see that for higher rho, consumption drops dramatically. So as I am increasing rho, my precautionary saving increases by this much, right? So my precautionary wealth increases by this much. You see that the increase in total stock demand, because it's the joint effect of these competing factors, is smaller, much smaller. But there is a huge effect of prudence on precautionary saving, on precautionary wealth. Does this make sense to you? Yeah? So that's the reason. Now, this finding was big trouble for papers, you know, some of the papers also that Gomez Michailidis did subsequently, that were trying, we're getting also data, you know, on stockholders and non-stockholders, and they were trying to use the model to match the share of stockholders and non-stockholders in the economy, right? Because one of the things you find in the data, in the survey data, is that if you ask people, wealthy people, how much risk they are willing to take, right? You know, trying to uncover their degree of risk aversion, you will find that wealthy people are actually less risk averse, right? Than the non-wealthy, the less wealthy people, okay? So you will find that wealthy people are willing to take more risks than less wealthy people, right? So they were trying to match the share of stockholders and non-stockholders in the data. And of course, we know that stockholders are wealthy people and non-stockholders are less wealthy people. So they were saying, okay, let's introduce, you know, risk aversion. Let's introduce this difference in risk aversion. Let's make the wealthy less risk averse than the non-wealthy. But as they were making them less risk averse means lower demand for stocks. Okay? So they had a fixed entry cost, and they were saying the wealthy are less risk averse, so they were getting them to get out of the stock market. And they were saying the less wealthy are more risk averse, so they were boosting their stock demand, and they were getting them into the stock market. So they were working themselves against the data, right? They were biasing their model against matching the data if they tried to incorporate the empirical finding that the wealthy are less risk averse. Okay, you understand what I'm saying, or have I lost you now? Have I lost you? I have lost you. Huh? You see what's going on here? That if I say that somebody is less risk averse, I'm climbing down the demand for stocks, right? So for any given wealth level, if I say that this person is less risk averse, the stock demand that the model will generate will be lower for that person, right? So suppose now I'm trying to generate a distribution of stockholders and non-stockholders in my model that or a composition, right, or of the population between stockholders and non-stockholders in my model that matches the composition in the population, right, in the data. Huh? I would want, for realism's sake, I would want to say that the wealthy people are less risk averse than the non-wealthy. Okay? To say that, when I say that, the wealthy people are shifting down in terms of demand for stocks, and the non-wealthy are shifting up. So for a given fixed cost, I am pushing more poor people into the stock market, and I'm driving more, you know, wealthy people out of the stock market. So I'm working against the data. It's not helping me. And then they had to make other assumptions, you know, wild assumptions to actually get the population split that they wanted. So eventually they figured out a way to solve this problem. There is a way to solve this problem, and the way to solve this problem is to make the wealthy more patient, right? And if they are more patient, they are dying to go into the stock market. They're more likely to go. So not necessarily, focus on risk aversion, but focus on patience. So the more patient are going to save more, they are going to get wealthier, and because they are wealthier, they are going to have a higher demand for stocks, and they are going to be more likely to overcome the fixed cost of entry. You see what I mean? So then you get in the data the wealthy to be in the market, and the less wealthy to be out of the market. You get in the model that, which is what is happening in the data as well, right? So if you are going to try to replicate the population distribution at some future point in your lives, don't operate on risk aversion unless you have different types of preferences where you can decompose prudence and risk aversion. And in fact, the 2005 paper that they had can decompose this, but still, even in that case, you're getting in trouble. So don't focus on risk aversion differences between the wealth and the stockholders and non-stockholders, but focus on wealth level difference. And you're going to get the wealthy in and the less wealthy out. Okay. Yes. So that's a good place to stop. So let's stop. And after so much food for thought, we can get some real food.
Professor,
Yeah.
so actually, with higher growth,
With higher wealth,
higher growth,
grow, yeah.
so they tend to save more students, more professionally saving.
Yes.
However, like the stock holdings too higher.
The
Because
stock
they have
holding,
a
yes.
lot of money in.
So they are not going to put everything in stocks, okay? Because you see, this distance is the extra saving, the extra saving that they are doing because of higher risk aversion, right? And higher prudence, right? And you see that this distance is not the same as this distance. So they are not going to put everything, so they're going to put the rest in bonds, right? In the risk asset. But they are going to have also experienced a small, the more risk averse here, going in this direction. You see, this is going in this direction, and this is going in this direction. So the more risk averse are going to put a little bit more in stocks. And that's the problem. That's what complicates matching the data, right?
Yeah.
If you are really focusing on risk aversion and you are telling the grandma story of risk aversion. So you want to focus on something else if you are going to try to replicate the data. So prudence, patience. Yeah.
So tell us on the real data, the empirical evidence.
The empirical evidence.
Wow.
Because as we are going to see, the stock market participation shoots up, in the upper wealth, the upper parts of the wealth distribution. These are mostly the stockholders, right? So you are not going to get this from a model like that if you just base everything on risk aversion. But if you base things on patience and prudence, then you're going to get it. That's the